Hi, I'm Bill Tsutsui, and it's a pleasure to have this opportunity to talk with you. Thank you to Yumi Nagasawa and Japan Society for inviting me to do this lecture and to be with you all in person, as it were, on December 5th. I'm eager to get to know you and to learn from you then. I'm looking forward to discussing Japanese popular culture and how it can be used in the classroom with you all. Let me start with a little bit of background. So, on March 11th, 2011, the day of the big earthquake, tsunami, and the starting of the Fukushima nuclear crisis in Japan, I happened to be in Tokyo. I was with a group of Japanese Americans, a delegation going around the country, and we were in a tour bus, and we just pulled up outside one of the big hotels in central Tokyo. The bus was turned off, but it kept moving. The earth had started shaking, and it was clear there was an earthquake. It was also clear it wasn't just a normal earthquake. It went on for a very long time, and it was very strong. And as we looked out of the windows of the bus, we could see the skyscrapers around us swaying, sort of like trees in the breeze. And after a moment, people began running out of the buildings. After what seemed like an eternity, it finally ended. Of course, at that point, we didn't know anything about how bad it was going to be on the Tohoku coast or about the tsunami that was coming, of course. But the guy who was sitting next to me, who knew a little bit about me and my interests, turned to me at that moment and said, "Bill, didn't that remind you of a Godzilla movie?" And indeed, it did. The buildings swaying, the ground shaking, the terrified Japanese people, conservatively dressed, running in fear. It did remind me of a Japanese monster movie. And in fact, it reminded of lots of people of Japanese monster movies, as well as other forms of Japanese pop culture that seem obsessed with apocalypse. Google and Wikipedia hits on Godzilla surged in March 2011, it turns out. It's natural, I think, that lots of folks would see a real-world event through the lens of pop culture. Really, how else can one relate to unprecedented levels of destruction? What seemed eerier was the widespread recognition of the theme of catastrophe running through Japanese culture, including the enduring thread of nuclear fear, stretching back to Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the Godzilla movies. The way in which the realities of the Tohoku coast and the Fukushima reactors seemed to echo the nightmarish visions of anime, manga, science fiction, and creature features was striking to people around the globe. But no one seemed to know exactly what to do with this observation. So what, in other words? Now, I've been interested in the apocalyptic tendency in Japanese pop culture for a long time. So in the bulk of my talk today, I'd like to just run briefly through the history of Japan's imagination of disaster as reflected in pop culture since World War II, and how critics and scholars have interpreted it. At the end, I'll circle back to 311 and reflect a little on what significance the theme of Armageddon in Japanese popular culture may have had on the ways in which Japanese people have reacted to the very real disasters of earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear crisis. Well, in his book, Ecology of Fear, Mike Davis seeks to establish LA's reputation as the disaster capital of the universe. Davis chronicles the rich profusion of novels and films that have managed to destroy Los Angeles in a remarkable, even riotous miscellany of ways, listing 138 literary and cinematic Armageddons between 1909 and 1996. The entire world, Davis assures us, seems to be rooting for Los Angeles to slide into the Pacific or be swallowed by the San Andreas Fault. No other city seems to excite such dark rapture. But Mike Davis, it seems, has been spending too much time in Southern California and not enough time watching Japanese movies, TV series, and animation. There can be little doubt that in the years since World War II, fictional apocalypse has been visited upon Tokyo more frequently than on any other location on the globe. In what one critic has described as the doom-laden dreams of Japanese pop, Japan's cities have regularly been toppled by earthquakes and cyclonic winds, swept by tidal waves, floods, and wildfires, victimized by volcanoes, alien invasions, and supernatural curses, poisoned by toxic pollution, leveled by a veritable parade of giant monsters, robots, and blobs, and, needless to say, obliterated by virtually every imaginable form of nuclear explosion. Audiences at home and abroad have been exposed to Tokyo's destruction in a remarkable range of media and genres, from silent movies to newsreels, from science fiction films to animated TV series, from exuberant comic books to realistic video games. Over most of the past 75 years, a period bracketed by the atomic attacks of 1945 and the triple disasters of 3/11, Japan's media consumers could take in the fictionalized destruction of their capital city on television or at a nearby movie theater at least every week and often every day. Now, having a morbid fascination with fictionalized disasters may seem obvious for a nation as prone to very real catastrophes of natural and man-made origin as Japan. Tokyo, for instance, may have been destroyed and rebuilt more than any other major city in the world, regularly ravaged by fire in the Tokugawa period and devastated by earthquakes and wartime air raids in the 20th century. Situated on the geological ring of fire and squarely on the track of Western Pacific typhoons, Japan is regularly the victim of tremors and storms, eruptions and tsunamis, floods and landslides. But despite such a history of real-life disasters, the apocalyptic imagination of contemporary Japanese pop culture has usually been traced back to Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the haunting memories and repressed fears of nuclear warfare. Of course, the literary scholar Susan Napier assures us, the atomic bombings are the most obvious catalyst to apocalyptic thought, a notion long assumed by commentators on Japanese mass entertainments. Such views have been articulated most consistently in recent years by the pop artist Murakami Takashi, who has argued vigorously for the formative influence of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and post-war Japanese society's inability to deal with those horrors on the creativity of Japanese pop culture. To Murakami, it fell to the makers of fantasy worlds, animators, comic book artists, sci-fi writers, film and TV producers, to reflect on a shared history of trauma that could not be discussed in polite mainstream Japanese society. Thus, the creators of Japan's doom-laden pop culture have, and I'll quote at length from Murakami, reimagined Japan's gravely distorted history, which the nation chose to embrace at the very beginning of its post-war life by repressing memories of violence and averting its eyes from reality. Japan is seemingly suspended in a historical amnesia, having little sense of the past and withdrawing from reality. Yet we continue to mine the ancient narrative strata of the Pacific War and recast the reality of the Cold War into another form. How many times have we burned Tokyo to cinders, tirelessly fended off invaders, and persevered through radioactive contamination in order to chip away at the imaginary reality that forced us into self-withdrawal? Now, not all critics have joined Murakami in interpreting Japan's pop fixation with devastation as a legitimate and sincere means of addressing the nation's troubled history and deep-seated anxieties. Many observers have seen the glowing mushroom clouds of B-movies and comic books as trivializing and sensationalizing the cynical exploitation of widespread nuclear unease rather than reasoned engagement with the ethics of atomic energy. Indeed, as Richard Hodgins has written, and I quote, "A 12-ton woman-eating cockroach does not say anything about the bomb simply because it too is radioactive or crawls out of a test site, and the filmmakers have simply attempted to make their monster more frightening by associating it with something serious." To Jonathan Lake Crane, cinematic monsters like Godzilla were pathetic claptrap, which sought to answer the most significant question of the 20th century with tacky special effects, papier-mâché sets, and idiotic plots. Perhaps the most time-honored interpretation of post-war apocalyptic science fiction films was that offered by the noted cultural critic Susan Sontag in her influential 1965 essay, The Imagination of Disaster. Sontag's analysis lay somewhere between the extremes of Murakami's vision of Japanese pop as traumatized self-reflection and the cynical view of celluloid Armageddons as mere gimmicks. To her, the appeal of post-war sci-fi cinema was its charming intersection between a naive and largely debased commercial art product and the most profound dilemmas of the contemporary situation, especially regarding the nuclear threat. Thus, a film like Rodan, in which giant pteranodons obliterate the Japanese city of Fukuoka, nods to, quote, the mass trauma that exists over the use of nuclear weapons and the possibility of future nuclear wars, while also reveling in the aesthetics of destruction, the peculiar beauties to be found in wreaking havoc, in making a mess. Urban obliteration in post-war science fiction, Sontag then goes on to argue, thus served a complex psychological function for the anxious movie-going masses of the Cold War world, at once distracting us from the threat of nuclear war, while simultaneously numbing us to the ever-present possibility of complete global obliteration. Scholars following in Sontag's interpretive footsteps have generally stressed the darkness and pessimism in the apocalyptic imagination of post-war Japanese popular culture. Susan Napier has written extensively on Japan's imagination of disaster and stresses, quote, the utter bleakness of the worlds delineated in Japanese science fiction. She contrasts the nihilistic tone and profound pessimism of Japanese apocalyptic fantasies with the less gloomy visions served up by Hollywood. Napier also stressed that Japanese pop culture grew considerably darker by the turn of the millennium than it had been in the immediate post-war decades. The secure horror of earlier times, she argues, when the audience could be assured that the monster would be vanquished and the survival of Japan affirmed by the end of a film's final reel, gave way to a kind of open-ended nihilism, a profound, even hopeless dystopian consciousness, particularly prevalent in manga and anime from the 1980s and beyond. But if post-war Japanese popular culture is indeed so nihilistic and haunted by the specters of Hiroshima defeat, the Cold War, and millennial social alienation, why then have so many of the Armageddons visited upon Tokyo by Japanese animators and filmmakers been so exuberant, so exhilarating, so humorous, even so downright joyful? For all the darkness of Japan's sci-fi fantasies, I would argue that there is a strand of optimism woven tightly into Japan's apocalyptic imagination. There is also a celebration of the visible spectacle of devastation, of Sontag's beauties to be found in wreaking havoc. What's more, pop culture depictions of mushroom clouds rising over Tokyo have at times expressed the subversive visions and liberating fantasies of post-war Japan, challenging taboos and exploring alternatives to business as usual. Thus, I would suggest, while we cannot ignore the lingering shadows and recurrent traumas of natural and man-made disasters on the Japanese worldview after 1945, the theme of catastrophe in Japanese pop culture may be less about exorcising the demons of Hiroshima and less a reflection of a profound nihilism than an unruly form of recreational fantasy and an unlikely source of inspiration for post-war Japan's sci-fi dreamers. So let's go back to the start. The experiences of Hiroshima and Nagasaki did figure prominently in Japanese cinema immediately following World War II, and especially in the years after the departure of the American occupation in 1952. The post-war A-bomb films did include some somber musings on war and the lingering nuclear threat, But by far the most famous treatment of Japan's atomic legacies was Gojira, the movie which launched the post-war master narrative of giant irradiated monsters attacking and devastating the Japanese capital city. Gojira was a dark film which drew on memories of Hiroshima and the firebombings of Tokyo in a visually arresting, emotional style. The story of a Jurassic survivor rendered huge and radioactive by U.S. H-bomb testing in the South Pacific, Gojira traces the monster's attacks on Tokyo, rendering the city a smoldering wasteland, much as it had been in 1945, and the creature's ultimate destruction by a new superweapon devised by a Japanese scientist. The film was intended by its makers as a strong anti-war and anti-nuclear statement aimed at an adult audience. Believe it or not, the film's director once remarked, "We naively hoped that the end of Godzilla was going to coincide with the end of nuclear testing." As numerous commentators have observed, however, Gojira was, for all the scenes of Tokyo in flames, a fundamentally optimistic movie. For despite all of Godzilla's destructive fury, the monster is eventually defeated, and the Japanese nation, even if wounded by this latest radioactive menace from across the seas, survives intact at the end. Above all, the film shows a tremendous faith in science and progress, as the creature, spawned by American science gone wrong, is finally vanquished by the yet more powerful creations of Japanese science, and by a profound trust in the Japanese establishment, the state, the military, the intellectual elites, as dependable, benevolent, and competent. Moreover, while Godzilla mourns the losses of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the bombings of Tokyo, the film also casts an unexpectedly positive light on the experience of catastrophe and suggests a kind of perverse nostalgia for the beneficial impact of crises on society, politics, and human relationships. For most of Gojira, up until Godzilla's devastating nighttime raids on Tokyo, an atmosphere of debate, division, and discord hangs over the movie. Scientists argue with government officials over whether the monster should be studied as a specimen or destroyed as a threat. In a famous scene in the Japanese Diet, the parliament, representatives clash over whether information on Godzilla should be made public or suppressed. Even at the family level, contention is rife as a love triangle divides loyalties among the film's major characters. But the attacks of Godzilla and the spectacle of Tokyo in shambles bring a sudden end to the disagreements and the pervasive sense of division in society. Faced with their capital city in ruins, the characters in Godzilla put aside their differences and rally together in unified resistance to the radioactive enemy. The decision to kill the monster is embraced by all, political squabbles become moot, and even individual strife fades away. In the closing scenes of Gojira, as the creature's demise is confirmed, the assembled throngs erupt in spontaneous cries of, "What exhilaration! What jubilation! We have won!" As some scholars have suggested, this ending might constitute a therapeutic restaging of the conclusion of World War II, with Japan coming out on top this time around. Yet the scene also seems to celebrate the spiritual unification of the Japanese people, ultimately drawn together in harmony and strength by a common foe and a brief glimpse into Armageddon. Even the destruction of Tokyo by a huge fire-breathing lizard can have its bright spots for the Japanese people, or at least so Gojira bids us to conclude. Moving forward then, the period from the late 1950s to the early 1970s was the high tide of growth and optimism in miracle economy Japan. Yet despite the surging GNP statistics and moments of national celebration like the 1964 Tokyo Summer Olympics, the years of high-speed growth were the very time that images of apocalypse, especially the fictionalized devastation of Tokyo, fully suffused Japanese popular culture. Gojira was Japan's first giant monster movie, a genre which flourished from the mid-1950s and which virtually came to define Japanese mass culture to global consumers, at least up until the 1970s. The Godzilla films were the leading franchise, with 28 pictures produced by Toho Studios in the half-century after 1954, making it the world's longest continuous film series. The typical plot of Japanese monster movies was entirely predictable. A giant creature attacks Tokyo, usually cutting a swath of destruction through the city and managing to knock down a landmark or two in the process. The authorities rally to stop the monstrous threat, but despite deploying every sort of military hardware imaginable, always fail to stem the attack. Ultimately, however, the monster is vanquished and Japan is saved by some lucky twist of fate or fortuitous scientific discovery. From the early 1960s, the pattern for the Godzilla films was for the star of the series, usually depicted in a heroic light, to defend Japan from enormous invading creatures in mortal combat. Even in these scenarios, urban annihilation, the destruction of miniature mock-ups of Tokyo by actors wrestling in latex monster suits, was part of the standard formula. A striking feature of Japanese sci-fi cinema was the regularity with which Tokyo was destroyed, only to be reconstructed before the next monster lumbered through town and the movie cameras rolled again. Tokyo thus took on a fantastical, self-healing quality, as the presumed multiple rebuildings of the city were apparently accomplished without any human agency. In none of the monster films from the 1960s or 1970s do we see machinery removing debris, workers repairing buildings, or civil leaders charting the redevelopment of their ravaged capital. This off-screen spontaneous regeneration of the urban fabric was particularly impressive in the live-action television series Ultra Q and its more famous successor, Ultraman. Both of these very popular weekly shows were produced by Tsuburaya Eiji, the special effects master behind the Godzilla franchise, and featured an attack on Japan by a new giant monster in each episode. In Ultraman, Japan is protected by the elite Space Patrol and is ultimately saved in each installment by the titular character, a kind of cosmic cop, a red and silver giant alien or robot from Nebula M78 who is committed to defending the Earth from all its enemies. And let me just show a short clip that I think really captures well the tone of Ultraman.
ルトラマンを支える太陽エネルギーは地球上では急激に消耗する。太陽エネルギーが残り少なくなるとカラータイマーが点滅を始める。そしてもしカラータイマーが消えてしまったらウルトラマンは二度と再び立ち上がる力を失ってしまうのである。
So the red light at Ultraman's chest is like his battery low indicator, and if it is blinking, he's getting worn out. As the Japanese critic Tatsumi Takayuki has observed, and I quote, "In the mid-1960s, the weekly Japanese TV series Ultraman, featuring a variety of post-Godzilla monsters, accelerated the alternation between destruction and reconstruction. However fatally Tokyo gets destroyed by brand new monsters, you will find the very same city reconstructed quickly and beautifully next week. Armageddon happens once a week, resurrection the following week. This is the two-beat jazz that Japan was dancing in its high-growth period." One writer has suggested that the more complicated a civilization becomes, the more fun it is to imagine the whole works going up in flames. And in high-growth era Japan, it seems, nothing beat the exhilarating fun of seeing Tokyo Tower toppled and Tokyo destroyed. But for all the scenes of ruin, from the creature features of the late 1950s to the anime of the 1970s, Japan's fictionalized urban apocalypses were generally painless, self-correcting, and thoroughly optimistic spectacles. The speed with which the metropolis recovered, bouncing back essentially unchanged on a weekly basis, was a reflection not just of the utterly fantastic nature of these pop culture depictions, but also of a profound and cheery confidence in progress, born perhaps of Japan's unprecedented economic advance and of the real-life thoroughness with which Japanese cities were being demolished, redeveloped, and transformed at the time. Susan Napier has contended that this apocalyptic temperament in the post-war Japanese imagination constituted a subversion of modernity, a rejection of notions of progress that always seemed redolent of their Western origins. Yet in monster movies, Ultraman and their pop culture offspring, with their endlessly and automatically regenerating urban landscapes, we may actually have seen the ultimate celebration of modernity and expression of faith in the sure hand of progress and the resilience of the Japanese nation. So jumping forward in time once again, from the early 1970s through the late 1980s, a period bookended by the unsettling impact of the oil shocks and the exuberant excesses of the bubble economy, the apocalyptic imagination remained firmly rooted in Japanese popular culture. The lightheartedness of earlier depictions of disaster was less in evidence, however, and the end of the world took on a decidedly darker cast. Yet for all the new and more starkly dystopian visions that appeared in films, on TV, and in animation, an enduring optimism and a deep confidence in redemptive, spontaneous, and inevitable recovery from annihilation continued to characterize Japanese pop culture. The smoldering wreckage of Tokyo remained an image that more often evoked hope than despair. Academic commentators usually stress the sense of social and psychological collapse in the apocalyptic pop culture of Japan in the wake of the oil shocks. For example, the landmark animated television series of the 1970s, Space Battleship Yamato, pivots on the grim vision of a coming Armageddon. In the year 2199, the Earth has been reduced to a radioactive wasteland by an endless barrage of nuclear bombs from the distant planet Gamulus. Humans, unable to stop the alien attacks, have retreated ever deeper underground to avoid the seeping radioactivity. Just as it seems that all life is about to be annihilated, a message is received from the planet Iskandar, promising a device that will scrub the toxins from the Earth's surface and providing instructions on how to construct an advanced intergalactic vessel. The new spacecraft is built, curiously enough, from the wreckage of the battleship Yamato, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, sunk on a suicide run to Okinawa in 1945. The resurrected ship and its crew face countless hazards on the way to Iskandar, but are eventually successful in their mission, retrieving the magical device and returning victoriously to regenerate the Earth. Strikingly, despite the series scenes of a cratered and lifeless Japan, perhaps the most moving images of Armageddon ever rendered in anime, Space Battleship Yamato remained well within the confines of secure horror, ending with humanity's salvation. Moreover, the series seemed to suggest even nuclear holocaust is reversible, albeit through utterly fantastical means, just as the urban destruction inflicted by Godzilla and the creatures on Ultraman could always be remedied out of sight and beyond rational analysis. The disaster film genre has also been generally interpreted as reflecting Japan's dark and troubled imagination in a time of unsettling economic, social, and demographic transitions. Although disaster films rose to prominence in Hollywood in the 1970s, and you'll remember blockbusters like The Towering Inferno, Japanese filmmakers took catastrophe as their theme more consistently through the post-war period and commonly portrayed disaster on a citywide or nationwide scale. The mother of all Japanese disaster films was undoubtedly Japan Sinks, which was the highest-grossing domestic release in Japan in 1974. The movie was based upon the best-selling novel of the same name by leading sci-fi author Komatsu Sakyo and depicted what one critic has called a series of catastrophic fires, tidal waves, volcanoes, and soap opera histrionics before climaxing with the entire nation itself plunging into the drink. The film, like the novel, was presented with thoroughly sober pseudo-scientific solemnity. Watching the entire Japanese archipelago slip seismically beneath the waves prompted another commentator to conclude that, in the Japanese apocalyptic imagination, and I quote, progress was to be inseparable from pessimism. As Japan grew in post-war affluence, so did the need to drown it. Japan Sinks, the novel, even more so than the movie, described the death throes of the islands in a distinctive manner, combining allusions to the atomic attacks and the firebombings of Tokyo with a lyrical, almost erotic portrayal of the nation's submersion. But in the end, the message of the novel is not entirely dark. The Japanese homeland is lost, but a majority of the Japanese people are saved, relocated to other nations. Strikingly, Komatsu's novel ends not with despair at the loss of the physical space of Japan, but with the hopeful notion that misfortune will challenge the Japanese people and push them to ever greater heights. This then will be a test for the Japanese, he wrote. Their bridges have been burned behind them. they have no choice but to go forward. Whether they wish it or not, the chance to achieve adulthood is being forced upon them. As Japan traversed the millennium, apocalypse remained a prominent feature of the pop imaginary. Visions of Armageddon were assumed by commentators to be a natural response to the ills that beset Japanese society after the collapse of the bubble economy in 1989. But despite a profound national sense of rupture and uncertainty during what was called the Lost Decade, Japanese audiences did not wallow in somber, nihilistic visions of a dystopian future. Fictionalized apocalypses may still have referenced the now distant memories of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but those traumas seemed not so much raw wounds as deep sediments in the popular imagination. Despite a number of real catastrophes during the 1990s, notably the sarin gas attacks of the doomsday cult Aum Shinrikyo and the 1995 earthquake in Kobe, Japan's apocalyptic imagination at the millennium remained insistently optimistic, even more so than in previous decades, and faith in the establishment, particularly the military and the state, was unusually overt. In the 2006 remake of Japan Sinks, repackaged as a sleek action-adventure movie with glossy special effects and little of the elegiac air of the original novel, Japan is miraculously saved from submersion at the 11th hour by some purely fantastical science and the extraordinarily brave and selfless service of Japanese civil servants. We are left at fade out with the archipelago a little soggier, but the state revealed as eminently trustworthy and firm, the Japanese family resolute in a time of uncertainty, and the Japanese spirit indomitable. The Godzilla films of the early 21st century, meanwhile, send a similar message. Though Tokyo never escapes ruin, the end of the world always seems to be averted, thanks to the professionalism, resolve, and effectiveness of the Japanese self-defense forces. Thus, even in the wake of Aum and Kobe, secure horror remained the norm in depictions of disaster in Japanese pop culture, and remarkably enough, a certain playfulness continued to sneak into cinematic visions of the apocalypse. So, in the satirical The World Sinks Except Japan, a delightfully cheesy comedy which pokes fun at Japan's global aspirations, debates over immigration policy, and the disaster movie genre, the story breezily ends with Japan, beset with ethnic tensions and economic ills, joining the rest of the world under the seas. Trauma and the lingering shadows of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are nowhere to be seen at the end of The World Sinks Except Japan. Armageddon is just good for one final laugh before the credits roll. Now, Tatsumi Takayuki has observed that, and I quote, "While nuclear disaster began as an essential tragedy in the mid-20th century, it has gradually transformed itself into a kind of literary motivation for black comedy." One might well conclude that even in Japan, with its unique history of nuclear trauma, fictionalized apocalypse has become a gimmick, an expedient plot device, or a kind of visual spectacle that neither the creators of popular culture nor its consumers have yet to tire of thoroughly. Armageddon has thus been a constant in the post-war Japanese imagination, an image as common as heart-pounding car chases in action films or dreamy sunsets in romances. To read Japan's doom-laden dreams as pervasively freighted with darkness and trauma is, in my opinion, to overestimate the psychic legacies of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and to minimize the recreational quality of the aesthetics of destruction. It is also to misunderstand the post-war apocalyptic imagination as, above all, a commemoration of loss and a kind of therapeutic arena for addressing unresolved tensions. Those fictional mushroom clouds and firestorms that have engulfed Tokyo for the past 60 years have, more often than not, affirmed progress, science, and the status quo, and at times have even expressed nostalgic, reactionary yearnings for the return to an elusive past of collective unity and common purpose. In the wake of the disasters of 3/11, there has been a lot of discussion about how poised and composed the Japanese people were in confronting earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear crisis. And let me just tell you my own experience. Being in Tokyo during the earthquake was fascinating. So immediately afterwards, everything shut down. The trains all shut down, and it essentially was impossible to get around the city. It happened during the workday, so a lot of folks were caught in town, and they couldn't get home to where they lived in the suburbs, which meant a lot of spouses started driving into Tokyo to pick them up. And it was complete gridlock. And it really was like the city shut down for about 12 hours. The roads were full. People were milling about. But it was amazing to see how people responded. Everything was so calm and so orderly at this time. There were very neat lines behind payphones and in front of ATMs. At restaurants that were running out of food, the owners made sure to divide what they had so everyone who was waiting could eat. And what was really amazing to me was that in the 8 or 9 hours I walked around Tokyo on the night of that earthquake, because I wanted to see what was happening, I only heard people sound their horns 3 times. Can you imagine what an American city would sound like after a disaster like this, with the roads completely clogged? It was really amazing. So in the media, in America at least, this response was commonly ascribed to Japanese culture and its supposedly ingrained traditions of personal control, dignity, and stoicism in the face of adversity. Many historians and Japanese studies specialists, meanwhile, pointed less at Confucian heritage and the traditional family structure than to the very modern apparatus of the Japanese state in conditioning the public response to disaster on a grand scale. In other words, the impressive behavior of the Japanese people was due less to the deep well springs of Japanese culture and more to a history of over a century of discipline and social management administered by Japan's government. The training of the populace, not only in disaster response, but also in a certain passivity in the public sphere, it was argued, was the key. I would add to this debate the contribution of a post-war history of mass entertainments saturated with the imaginary obliterations of Tokyo, Japan, and Japanese life as we know it. This steady pop culture diet of apocalypse prepared the Japanese people on some level for the experience of real-world catastrophe. It also, I believed, prepared Japan for the task of reconstruction and recovery, since the underlying message of Japan's imagination of disaster, as I've argued in this talk, is not necessarily dark and nihilistic, but fundamentally optimistic and rooted in an abiding, thoroughly modern faith in progress. Thank you so much. I appreciate you listening, and I look forward to meeting you in person on December 5th.